delight to have you here this afternoon and to introduce Susan Ashman, who's the lead park ranger and historic supervisor at the Springfield Armory, which is part of the National Park Service. She previously worked at Ulster Ridge Village as an historical interpreter at the Freeman Farm, I guess. She's skilled at butchering and old-time cookery. And before that, she was an aircraft mechanic for 8 years in the U.S. Air Force. She's given many presentations to Civil War roundtables, the Civil War Institute in Gettysburg, and multiple locations throughout New England. Today, she's going to tell us about her own historical research into the provenance of a single 1856 British Enfield rifle, which had the name H Weakley carved into the stock. So those of us who are interested in historical inquiry will have a good time. So thank you and welcome.
Absolutely, thank you so much. Anytime that I can talk about the Civil War, I get very excited. Have any of you been to the Springfield Armory National Historic Site? It is in Springfield, Mass, on the campus of Springfield Technical Community College. No? So I'll just tell you a little bit about it and why, I am here because of that. So the Springfield Armory was authorized by George Washington, right? We've all heard of the guy, been everywhere, slept everywhere. In 1794, making it the first national armory. So when Congress authorized an armory up north, they also authorized one down south, Harper's Ferry. So Harper's Ferry was pretty much our sister armory. But going back just a little more, before the Revolutionary War, we were mainly importing firearms from France. And after the Revolutionary War, since we were fighting for our independence, why depend on these foreign countries? Because you never know who you're going to be at war with someday, which we always seem to find out. So after that, having those two national armories where they can manufacture those firearms. Well, Harper's Ferry was not our sister armory for very long because when Virginia seceded from the Union in 1861, the U.S. Army went in there and they burned that one. So they went there to protect it at first, but then there was a lot of Confederate sympathizers who were working there, and they knew they weren't going to get any reinforcements. There was only about 50 of them and 13 regulars, and then they heard the Virginia militia was coming up with 350 men. So, if you can't beat them, just burn it. So that's what they did at that time. So at the armory, the government manufactured firearms for the U.S. military for 174 years, closed in 1968. So the whole campus was about 90 acres, employed just under 14,000 people in the spring of 1943, and 42% of those were women. So I thought it would be higher, but there was deferments for the men because they had such a skill there. So anybody you know in your family who's had an M1, there's a very, very good chance that was made at the Springfield Armory. And I'm just so impressed how our firearms from the Civil War all the way to Vietnam were going all over the world just from Springfield. So that's pretty exciting there. So you can come visit the Springfield Armory. We're open Wednesday through Sunday, and the best part is it's free. So from 9:30 to 4, so come and see us sometime.
And is parking easy?
Parking is right in front. It can't even get it any easier. Even valet parking wouldn't even be that easy, so we got that.
Great.
So nestled, how this all began is we have over 10,000 firearms in our collection there. And it is whenever I go up into the storage room in our collection, visitors aren't up here because, really, how many firearms can you put out on a museum floor? Especially if you have interchangeable parts and they're all the same, a lot of them. Whenever I go up there, I cannot believe how silent it is, just the eerie silence up there. But when you think about it, we've all heard the expression, if walls could talk, right? What if historic weapons could talk? So when I went up there, I don't think it would be really as deathly quiet, but it would be just the opposite, where I feel like I probably have my hands over my ears because of the screaming, the terror, the homesickness, the crying that would be going on with these. And every one of these has a story. A lot of these, though, the Civil War firearms, they don't have serial numbers on them. Serial numbers started in about 1865. So these are pretty anonymous. You just don't know the story behind them. But nestled amongst these 10,000 firearms is one that stood out to me. Now, many of the Civil War firearms have carbons in them, which is fascinating to me because out of all the wars, the Spanish-American War, the World War I, World War II, Vietnam, it's the Civil War stocks that have more carbons in them than any other one. I don't know if then the government was cracking down on people who was defacing government property at that time, but I guess there was a lot of time in camp sitting around the fire, so there was all sorts of artwork that they would do, and also my favorite is when they carve their names into them, because now with Ancestry and Fold 3, I am on the internet quite a lot, just like, who are these guys? You know, how did they do through the Civil War? And so one of those was the Weakley rifle. I don't know, I think this one was more because of the battle damage on it, not necessarily, you can barely see the H Weakley on the stock, but then look here, you can see the battle damage here, and also, I'm going to show you a picture later on, there's a mini ball stuck forward of the trigger assembly there. It's missing some parts as well, so it was damaged pretty good, and we're going to hear the story behind that. So it was mostly the battle damage of this one that really stood out to me because a lot of them didn't have that. And it's pretty interesting what battle this happened because I have a huge interest in that particular battle, which was fascinating to me. So I found out that that rifle belongs to, his name's H Weakley, but it's Rufus H Weakley, and he was born on January 5th, 1840 to Thomas Jefferson, not that Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson Weakley and Jerusha Weakley of Cheatham County, Tennessee. So they had a farm. This is, the father was Isaac Weakley. So this was his plot just right here. It was a couple of 100 acres, and they grew tobacco, corn, wheat, oats, and a lot of root vegetables in their garden. And siblings included, you guys all need a list for this one, Mary Jane, William Isaac, John Caroline, Lucinda Paulina, George Thomas Robert, and younger brother James Polk. So we have an even dozen in that family of kids. I'm sure you've all heard that, well, we have a farm, so we need a lot of kids to work on the farm, right? So this was the census in 1860. You can see that Robert Weakley was a mill worker at that time. George Washington Weakley, there's like a theme here, was a school teacher. You have Thomas Weakley, who he was a farmhand, and then Rufus Weakley and James Polk Weakley, another president in the family, was also listed there. All the older kids were mostly married and moved off by then, so these were like the last 5 that were living at home at that time. So a couple of, they knew the call to arms, they heard the call to arms to join the Confederate cause, came knocking on the Weakley door in 1861, and George, Robert, and Thomas all answered that call immediately. They all 3 enlisted in the 42nd Regiment, Tennessee, Company G, and this was part of Corliss's brigade under Waltham's division under Stuart's corps at that time. So they all went off to Camp Cheatham there. This is the only thing that is left there. And usually these camps are where you're going to stay in this area for a while for more, to join, to answer that call. You're going to do your training there, your drilling there, you're going to get your firearm there as well just to start. Now it's really interesting because they all enlisted right away in June of 1861, but Rufus did not enlist until October 24th, 1861. So if you live on a farm, why do you guys think that is? Like enlist right away. But there was only Rufus and his brother James left on the farm. He was around 15 at that time. So I would say that's why they stayed back for a while. But he couldn't wait very long because he did enlist there as a private. Same company as his brothers. There are Weakleys everywhere in this county. Like it's very hard. Like you just fall into a Weakley every time I'm looking for things. So they were all in this one company, this company G at that time. So his brother James did the same thing. He waited another year and he enlisted on November 15th, 1862. And then there was nobody on the farm, only mom and dad at that time. And I'm sure if some of you who read about the Civil War and how these armies would just go through the land, just taking what they could from these farms. The food, the animals, the stock, the fields, they destroy your fences, they use that to burn, to make their campfires. So it was very devastating in this area, like many others. So Rufus also trained at Camp Cheatham in Cedar Hill, Tennessee. And it was used for less than a year before that camp was abandoned at that time. His regiment was ordered to Fort Donelson on February 12th, where they moved down the river by steamer, arriving on February 13th. And you think of, this has to be pretty exciting to live on that farm for so long, not probably get out, and then all of a sudden you have this sense of patriotism. And you're like, oh, this is going to be over in no time. I'll be home by Christmas. No worries. And so they're leaving the farm for the first time. He's on this steamer. He's with young men of his own age, which was a problem in camp because then a lot of times, chicken pox or smallpox would be going through these camps. Kind of like COVID at the time. So the Battle of Fort Donelson took place in northern Tennessee at that time. And this was Private Weakley's first engagement. So he only enlisted 4 months previously to that. So as soon as they got off the boat, they went to support the 30th Tennessee Infantry, which was being charged by federal troops at that time. And it's interesting because the weather was unseasonably warm. And you think this is February at that time in 1862. And so they were ordered to leave all their baggage at the wharf, like their blankets, their coats, everything there. And so Thomas Turner of the 42nd Tennessee, and in the same company as Private Weakley, said, soon night came on, and with it the cold rain, then sleet, then snow, and to make our distress complete, our men were nearly all without coats. We were ordered to leave our baggage at the wharf, which we did, and never heard of it again. Hence, in this condition, the 42nd Regiment fought the Battle of Fort Donelson, and in this condition, they were surrendered on the morning of February 16, 1862. So the Battle of Fort Donelson was a complete Union victory, and Grant had this very strict, just like, all surrender, I'm not going to give you any leeway, everybody's surrendering. That was about 13,000 troops. And I don't know about you, but I'm pretty miserable when I'm cold, and especially at night, and you're thinking no jackets, and there's nothing worse than sleet. So this was, again, Private Weakley. He's probably thinking, I left the farm for this. So that was probably hard. So, again, about 13,500. It was one of the largest surrenders at that time. And so the War Department didn't even know what to do with all these prisoners at that time. That was a large number. So they figured it out. About 7,000 of them would soon be sent to Camp Douglas outside of Chicago. I never heard of Camp Douglas. We all hear of Andersonville Prison or Elmira, that was up in New York, but I never heard of Camp Douglas. And so supposedly it is on the south side of Chicago, and by rail and steamboat, the first prisoners from Fort Donelson started to arrive at Camp Donelson on February 20th. So it was about a 4-day excursion to get down there. And it was interesting too because the prisoners found that basically there was no Camp Douglas in February at that time. Because again, the War Department didn't know what to do with these guys, and initially Camp Douglas was a training base for Union soldiers. So they didn't have the walls up, the fences up at that time either. There was a lot of escapees. So G.L. Wells of the 7th Texas Infantry was pleased with his accommodations after the rough trip by steamer and train. I remember the disembarking at Chicago by daylight on the morning of February 20th. I recall how we stood shivering in the cold, crisp atmosphere waiting for the command to take up the march to the quarters that had been prepared for us. Colonel Mulligan was in command of the camp. With a foresight that does credit to his heart of him, who suggested it, the stoves in the barracks into which we were ushered had been heated red hot, and the barracks had been fitted with new hay, a more comfortable place under the circumstances I never saw. So you don't hear a lot of prisoners saying that when they go into a prisoner of war camp. But that is soon going to change real quick. So the conditions started deteriorating very quickly. Camp Douglas was fairly new, founded in the fall of 1861, again as a training camp and a staging area. And it was covered about 80 acres, which isn't like too large, a couple of blocks. And but due to the prisoner exchanges, which they were still having at the beginning of the Civil War, the numbers that were held there were always fluctuating. So it was very hard to get an idea of how many numbers were there. But it was one of the largest prison camps in the North at that time, holding a total of about 26,000 men by war's end. That's not all together, that's just in and out continuously. So it was sometimes described too as the North Andersonville prison. And from February through September in 1862, this was when Rufus Weakley was there and his brother, 518 prisoners died. And when you think about those conditions when they first got there, how the guy was like, hey, these are really nice, you know, I guess considering what he was used to beforehand. And then when he gets to this camp, you know, soon people are dying. So on April 10th in 1862, a petition was sent from Camp Douglas to Andrew Johnson, who was the military governor of Tennessee at that time, expressing a desire to take the oath of allegiance to the federal government and hoping that Andrew Johnson would intercede and get them released or basically exchanged at that time. So by that time, there was about 8,000 of them. So that was pretty quick. A lot of the officers went to a different camp, so they weren't with the enlisted. But 8,000, that was a pretty high number at that time. So on August 28, 1862, Colonel Tucker, he was the camp's first commander at that time, he received word to begin transferring prisoners for exchange as soon as practical. So this is pretty neat. This must be Rufus Weakley's prison number here. And then if you go across, it kind of goes here. And then it basically says that he was going to be exchanged in Cairo on September, I think it is, 14, 1862. So he was really, that group was really, really fortunate because soon Grant stopped all the exchanges throughout the rest of the Civil War at the time. So I think he just went right under the wire on that one. So they were going to leave in groups of 1,000, and they were loaded onto freight cars on the Illinois Central Railroad in Cairo, or to Cairo, then transferred onto steamers down the Mississippi River to Vicksburg. They would travel by day with a big white flag on those steamboats. They would anchor at night, midstream. They didn't talk a lot about people, you know, jumping off or anything, but then why would they if they were going to be exchanged? No reason. And so Vicksburg was unprepared, just like Camp Douglas. Vicksburg was going to be the site of the exchange, but they were unprepared for that. So they went just a little further south to Clinton, Mississippi for that exchange. And I think they were pretty shocked that conditions in Clinton were just about worse than Camp Douglas at the time. It's kind of like now with the inflation, they were talking about how much things were, like bread, like $1 per pound back then, which was quite expensive. And they just didn't have enough food for them at that time. So basically the 42nd, they were a little reorganized, but they got back together. This is where Rufus Weakley probably received a different firearm from the one that he initially had when he first joined, because they took those away once they surrendered. So they were regrouped at that time. And then all the men ages between 18 and 40 were conscripted for another 2 years. So they probably thought, oh, I took the oath of allegiance, I'm going to go home, but not so fast. So they had 2 more years or longer without any furloughs. And it's interesting because, at one time he was pretty close to home, and now, they're going to be going all throughout the South at that time. So the 42nd moved out. They engaged in different battles, and in 1864, they joined the campaign through Georgia, fighting battles at New Hope Church, Pine Mountain, Kennesaw, Smyrna Depot, Peachtree Creek, Atlanta, and Lick Skillet. The weeks that followed would soon be the virtual destruction of the Army of Tennessee at that time. You got to think about it too, like how many of these men were 100% during these battles. I mean, when dysentery was huge during that time, they're hungry. If any of you have had to wear shoes from like the 1860s, or when I worked at Sturbridge Village, I had those brogans that I had to wear with the wooden soles. I mean, they didn't have Dr. Scholl's in these days during the Civil War. So they were wooden, inside, and there was no left or right, so you had to kind of break them in at that time. Oh. And you think all the marching they did, I think I would have thrown those shoes in the mill pond or something, because anything would have been better than that. So one of the bigger battles is coming up. It's the Battle of Franklin, and that occurred on November 30th, 1864. And it was the most destructive to the 42nd Regiment than any other previous battle. It's basically General Hood's last push to destroy General Schonefield's army. And so the Federal Army got to the small town of Franklin, Tennessee, first at around dawn. So they're way ahead of the Confederates at that time. And they wasted no time building these earthworks and defensive breastworks. And the line that formed basically a semicircle around the town, but it was over a mile in length, and they had the river too at their backs, which is pretty good. On top of these breastworks and on top of this was Osage orange shrubs. Are you guys familiar with those? They grow a lot down south. It's hard to say if they're a tree or a shrub, but they're very thorny and vine-like. And so what they did here, you have all these breastworks going up here. So this is the Union forces, all in blue. These are the Confederates. And this is all the orange Osage that the Union Army cut down, and they'd stack it on top of the breastwork. So it's about 8 feet high. So again, the 42nd was under Waltham's division, and so they're and under Corliss. So Rufus Weakley is heading right into the 65th Indiana and 65th Illinois, right into the Osage orange. And so it's all full of thorns. Also, it's 8 feet high, and you have the breastworks, but the Union Army had all these nice little holes in through the breastworks. Also, the problem was, this is all open ground here, all open. Have some of you heard of Pickett's Charge, Gettysburg? Right, supposedly, the big charge over open ground that was about a mile. This was 2 miles, but you don't hear about it much. So 2 miles of open ground that those Confederates are kicking off of and going right into the Federal breastworks, which it's just like, ugh. So it was a beautiful fall day. The sky was clear and the temperature almost reached 60 degrees. Again, one of those nice warm days. So Colonel Ellison Capers in the 24th South Carolina wrote, "We beheld the magnificent spectacle the battlefield presented. Bands were playing, general and staff officers and gallant couriers were riding in front of and between the lines. 100 battle flags waving and smacking in the smoke of battle and bursting shells were wreathed in the air with great circles of smoke, while 20,000 brave men were marching in perfect order against the foe." So again, it's General John Bell Hood's Army of Tennessee was going to destroy General Schofield and his federal army before they got to Nashville. And even so many of General Hood's officers, they saw this. They saw what the federal army was doing, and they're like, don't do it. You know, it's not looking good. You don't even need a telescope to see this. The flat area there was called Winston Hill. Again, all open ground, so you can see right down below them. They had, Union Army got there around dawn, then the Confederate Army got there about noonish, and at 4 p.m., roughly 20,000 Confederate soldiers stepped off the line and began advancing toward almost the same number of Union troops. 2 miles of open ground. Union artillery fire was ripping into the Southern lines. The Confederates' attack soon escalated into a headlong charge. So this started at 4 p.m. Guess what time sunset was? 4:38. This was a 5-hour battle, basically in the dark. So I am so fascinated by this battle. Just when you think, you know, there's no street lights or nobody's got flashlights out there. In the dark. So William Corliss's brigade, which the 42nd was part of, was raked with artillery fire into their right flank. Officers and soldiers were hacking at the branches of that orange osage with their swords and knives, just hoping to break the snarl up of those branches and thorns. But all you could hear were the screams of terror mixed with cursing and yelling. Some of the men tried to crawl over the top of the thorny pieces only to get tangled up and shot to pieces at that time. Waltham's front line was torn to pieces. Many men fell. Dead and wounded bodies fell onto the Osage. There, the mangled and torn remains created a haunting spectacle as they hung partially suspended in those thorny branches. I think when I think about that, I think of World War I on the barbed wire there in no man's land at that time. Men were also picked off with Henry repeaters and also Springfield rifle muskets, and the wounded, unfortunately, were repeatedly shot until they died. And Rufus Weakley and his brother James were also killed here. So it had to have been somewhere in here, because from the battle damage on the rifle, I don't think he got there, which we'll talk about a little. So the battle was approximately, again, 5 hours in length, perhaps the 5 bloodiest hours of the Civil War, and mostly fought at night. Around 8,500 combined casualties, roughly 6,000 of these being Confederates. 14 Confederate commanders became casualty, and 55 regimental commanders were wounded. So sometimes you would only have a sergeant in charge, and I think that really confused a lot of the men, like, who are we to lead? What are we supposed to do? Albert McKinney said, "I can never forget the blood-red sun going down through smoke at our backs while we moved toward the federal fire, nor how later in the evening the ground was so slippery with blood that men could scarcely retain their footing, and the air was so heavy with the smell of blood and gunpowder that it was almost sickening to a soldier." And another thing is, some of those Union soldiers were piling up the Confederate dead and using them as breastworks. At that time, some of the wounded had to crawl out from the dead. Sometimes too, there were so many men in front of the cannons that they were trying to fire, they'd have to knock the bodies over to keep firing. I mean, it was just annihilation for the Army of Tennessee at that time. So can you imagine how Franklin looked at sunrise the following day on December 1st, 1864, just after around 6 a.m. So you have death just hanging in the air at that time. You have total destruction and devastation. Besides bodies, you have a lot of dead horses, you have broken wagons at that time, just everywhere you looked. And Franklin had a population of about 2,000 before the battle, and now you have about 40,000 armies in there on both sides. So many soldiers who survived the battle, Confederates, were now assigned to the grim task of burying those Confederates. So after the battle at night, late at night, the Union moved out of there. They went up to Nashville. So the Confederates were left there, and it was their job to start burying those dead. And at that time, I think there was about over 1,700 that they needed to bury at that time. And that included Rufus Weakley and his brother James. So a lot of those who were killed in front of those breastworks, it's interesting, they were buried where they fell at that time, and they took very good notes on where a lot of those soldiers fell at that time too. So they were identified by name, if not by name, their unit, and the information was carved on crude wooden markers, and this is where they remained buried for over a year. But when you think about it, all that farmland is somebody's farmland, right? So they're not going to want to leave them there because they want to start plowing those fields. And just, you think of the desecration if you're just going to plow those fields. So it was very interesting because Carnton Plantation was owned by John and Carrie McGavick. Have you guys heard of Carnton Plantation in Franklin, Tennessee? So this was used as a field hospital all throughout the battle, as well as the outbuildings too. Every bed, floor space was taken up by the injured and dying men. Patients were covering the porch and yard, and Carrie McGavick became known as the Angel of Carnton for her tireless efforts caring for the wounded and dying that passed through the doors of Carnton. It was so peaceful, and then the battle erupted, and they just came in, took the doors off the hinges, were using those as surgery tables. When you go there today, you can still see a lot of blood in the floorboards. Also, when they would say when Carrie would walk through the men, the bottom of her dress was just drenched in blood at that time. So how can you plow a field where soldiers are buried? So the deteriorating graves and markers were probably the motivating factor in exhuming the dead, but then what do you do with the dead at that time? So John McGavick donated a suitable plot of ground out of his landed possessions, embracing a portion of the battlefield, which was pretty neat. And a board was soon established, and 1 week later, they made an official call for funds for that battlefield. So many of the former patients who convalesced at Carnton contributed several $100s toward the expense of conveying and removing the dead. So the bidding process began, and the final price was $5 per body. And back then, that was about $88.19. But that's a lot of work. I mean, you got to exhume the dead, move them to Carnton, and then bury them again. And if the team was unable to identify the bodies by either name or state, it was moved to an exclusive unknown section. And so this is how they wrote it up initially when they were going to bury them. So this was the original plot plan there. This is what Carnton looks like today. I've been there twice to pay my regards. By June 1866, the work of gathering the Southern dead was complete at 1,481 burials. So not only did the McGavicks donate their land, but they are also in charge of the maintenance of that cemetery as well that fell to them. And Carrie, that was like her call to take care of that cemetery and the soldiers. And over the years, more and more soldiers and family members would come to visit, and she carried this book. Some people call it the Book of the Dead, her cemetery book, where the list of all those names of those buried. And every time you see one of the large stones, this is, say, for instance, Tennessee, the Tennessee Regiment, and then all those listed were in that section. So it's pretty neat how they have different sections. And this is the largest, even though it's not that large, it's the largest private Confederate cemetery anywhere, which is pretty neat. It's such a beautiful set in there. So also though, once Carrie died, there's a better shot there of that. And this is Carrie there. Since the death of her husband, Mrs. McGavick has kept personal supervision over these graves. She never wearies in showing hospitalities to old Confederates who visit the scene of this terrible conflict. And she was the one, she always wore black after that, all the time, and would just take care of those. So both Rufus and James were buried in the McGavick Cemetery. And again, there's that cemetery book that they kept safe for so long with the names of the soldiers buried in that cemetery. And when Carrie died, it passed to her son, Winder. I think his name's Winder or Winder. But he didn't live too long, and then it passed to her daughter, Hattie, and her husband, George Cohen. But then some shocking changes were made to this book, which is very sad. They started getting letters from family members saying, hey, do you have these South Carolina soldiers buried in your cemetery? Or do you know of this soldier's, for instance, it wasn't James Polk, but this soldier. And he would start crossing out unknown and writing the name of that soldier's name. He was telling them what kind of they wanted to hear. But even though they're unknown, he was changing names to that book, which added a lot of confusion at that time. So this also happened, sadly, to Rufus and James. So technically, they have a stone there. That's what all these stones look like here. This is James K. H Weakley, stone 197. He's not there. That just makes me so sad. So he's in that unknown section with his brother there because they could not be identified at that time. But I think just knowing that they're in that cemetery is nice. So the Civil War completely destroyed the Weakley family at that time. So George Washington Weakley the older, despite multiple wounds, he survived the war. Robert Weakley lost a leg at the Battle of New Hope Church on May 26, 1864. Thomas Weakley was killed at that battle by a shell on the same day. Rufus and both his brother James were killed at the Battle of Franklin. And look at the parents. Thomas Jefferson Weakley died January 31st, 1867, and she died 4 days later. Like, was that a broken heart? Was that influenza? I tried to see if there was some sort of epidemic at that time. I don't know, but I just find that so tragic. Just the whole family almost gone. Also, one of their sisters, her husband was killed as well during that time. So the battle damage on this rifle. So this is underneath the rifle. This was facing the enemy. So we're thinking that he probably had it at shoulder arms. So it was like tucked against his shoulder. He was probably walking into battle at that time. Because otherwise, if he was aiming it, you wouldn't have had the mini ball go up and underneath the trigger assembly there. So there's that mini ball. So he was probably marching, they were stepping off line, and it was somewhere in those 2 miles of open ground. So it looks like he didn't make it to the federal breastworks at that time. He must have been peppered with artillery and shot. If that was so close to his hand, you know, and the rest of the firearm there. So again, he was probably killed in that open area there. So how did Rufus's firearm get to the Springfield Armory? I don't know. I'd love to know. That's, it's such a mystery. The thing is, after battles, ordnance officers would walk the battlefield and they collect firearms, something that they could use, or they may send them back to the armory for storage, repurpose it, and send them out to another battle. I don't know. I think they picked this one up because of the battle damage. We have no other ones with a mini ball stuck in near the trigger assembly. So I think it was the heavy battle damage and then how his name was on there. And that's how it came to the armory. I can't stand it when I can't like find the answer to things. So many of the Civil War firearms, again, are anonymous because the serial numbers don't come on until 1865. But it's pretty cool that Rufus left his calling card on his rifle. So it's pretty cool. I always get emotional at this part. That is Rufus Weakley's great uncle, Stephen. So I was able to connect like the past to the present or the present to the past, however way you want to see it. But shockingly and so sadly, 2 weeks later, Stephen passed away.
Oh.
But it's pretty neat that he got to hold that rifle. And I didn't know that he was sick at the time. He died of Hodgkin's lymphoma. And he's the one who I learned so much about the family from his visit. So to me, that's what it's all about, is connecting the past to the present or vice versa. So if you want to read more about the Battle of Franklin, here are some really good books. This is historic fiction based on the Battle of Franklin. So if you want to know more about Carrie, that's about her and taking care of the soldiers at that time. So that is it. So thank you. Sorry, I got a little emotional there.
No, thank you for that. It reminds us that history is full of stories.
Oh, it is, and I just look at all the stories, like when I look up all those firearms up in the collection, and they have no name, or those soldiers are just anonymous, and it's just so sad to me.
I love your thinking of the quiet storage room as being peppered with voices. That's just a lovely
Thank you. Yeah.
analogy. I think something that a lot of us forget. We work with objects, we know our objects, but
Right.
sometimes we forget that they have really interesting past stories.
Or whose hands held those. You know, that's what's fascinating to me. But I just get so frustrated when I'm like, no, I want the answer, you know. And I'm fortunate to have gone to Tennessee multiple times and just like talked to more descendants. And I just found Jerusha and Thomas Jefferson's burial plot, so that was pretty exciting too. But it's so sad how Rufus and James never got to go home. But they're with their comrades there at McGavick Cemetery, and it is a gorgeous cemetery. You can go tour Carnton Plantation as well. Franklin is now a very upscale neighborhood south of Nashville, so you know, but more and more they're seeing in that battlefield, which is so important. So yeah, thank you. Any questions?
It seems to me likely that we don't hear that much about it because it was so horrendous, and there's no glory to assign to to anybody. But the other thought I had was, I believe that city in Illinois is called Cairo, like the syrup.
Thank you. Yes, that is great, because
It's spelled Cairo, but it's
Yeah.
pronounced
And I was,
Cairo.
I appreciate that so much, because I'm like, how am I gonna know how to pronounce that? And then same with like Winder Sun or
Yeah,
Winder,
that-
Winder.
Winder.
So I'm gonna call Carnton and ask them,
Yeah.
you know, what it is. So thank you for that, that's huge. Yes, yes.
Is that Franklin the same, in the same location where the not very long state of Franklin was on the eastern end of Tennessee? There was a state
Really?
of Franklin. It didn't last long. It got incorporated into Tennessee.
That's interesting. I don't know, but I will look that up, because it's just a hair south of Nashville.
Which is kind of in the middle of the state, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, well,
It is.
I guess
Yeah, it's right, yeah, near like,
it may not be.
right, but still, that's very interesting. It kind of reminds me of that story, The Free State of Jones, that movie there where they wanted to, it was a Mississippi, and they kind of, this town wanted to secede on their own from the Confederacy. So it's just like, how would that work out?
But the state of Franklin was.
Yeah, that's
I think,
interesting. I'll look at that.
more closer to revolutionary.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I was not aware of that.
Another thing, so much on the material that people inland worked with, men especially, wood. Consider what seamen were working. Scrimshaw.
That's
of
right.
sea,
Yes.
but carving in the interior but I see that as a parallel thing.
Absolutely, because look at all the time they have on those ships too, and same thing with these guys around the campfire, but I am always surprised at the talent that, you know, some of these carvings, the woodwork is gorgeous. And I'm like, how did they have those tools? You know, like, just bring that stuff with them? I don't know. So, yeah.
It seems ironic, the naming patterns within the family.
Right.
Here's George Washington.
Right, with Thomas Jefferson and James Polk, and I think it was
Yeah.
Robert Lee, their son.
Oh, okay, well that's.
You'd never get an Abraham Lincoln in that family.
No, but it's very interesting how they go
Yes.
off.
Talking about the carvings on the rifles, would there be like a photo book? Have people studied all of these carvings and, you know, categorized them, published them?
No, and that's what I was actually thinking of just doing a program on a lot of those personalized firearms and the story behind each one. What I found out, I have to say Ancestry has just opened up doors. And it's interesting because we don't know why. We usually have firearms from like Virginia and Kentucky, Union. Again, I don't know how this one slipped in here. That is just, I wish they kept better notes at the Armory, and they didn't. I think because they're like, ooh, 4,000 more firearms to put up. And the condition, most of them had multiple loads in them too. They were loaded, but some of them, one from Gettysburg had 23 loads in them.
The guy kept loading it.
Yeah, kept loading. I don't know, or he just didn't want to fire and he was just pretending. But soon you couldn't even get that ramrod, like maybe about this much with 23 loads in there. That thing would have gone off like a cannon and probably killed them. But most of them average 2 to 4 loads. Yeah, so, yeah, can you imagine today if you sent firearms back loaded and, you know, to the government? I don't think that would go over very well, so yeah.
Huh.
I love the personal stories.
Well,
So-
there must have been, you know, furniture makers at war. And they used to do beautiful carving on Victorian, you know, mid-century furniture.
Absolutely, yeah, or just how,
It's,
you know, being a farmer or a mill hand, you know, with the farm, you were pretty talented. We're working on machinery, and so what's a little carving to at that point?
I think the idea of doing a book of the designs, I think you'd probably.
Especially if you're looking into different parks like Chickamauga, they have an incredible firearms, and it's just like, boy, that'd be great if I could just travel around and just do research on this
Right, and your
virus.
little iPhone camera.
Yeah, exactly. They take great
Ancestry over
pictures
here,
and-
you can.
Yeah, it's a good point. Nobody's really, so maybe I'll come back with a book signing or something.
Yeah, go for it, go for it.
Somebody
Yeah.
ought to give you a grant to do that.
You know, they do have grants. I tried to get a grant for this to go to Tennessee and do the research. They wouldn't give me the grant, but somebody who needed to speak Spanish, like to take Spanish for a semester, he got the grant. I'm just like, what? So,
Oh, dear.
yeah, exactly.
So keep trying.
Yes, thank you. I will. I think I will. I like your book idea. Yes.
Oh,
Thank you.
well, thank you very much.
Absolutely. So
And,
come at the Springfield Armory
we
sometime.
will all make our way there, I'm sure. This is fun.
Oh, that'd be great.